Chapter 14, Forging the National Economy. All right, so when we talk national economy, we're talking about the entire United States, obviously national. The entire United States at this time in the early 1800s was a lot smaller than the entire United States today for obvious reasons, but more and more people were beginning to move westward, which we've talked about that window in time. And consequently, the economy is going to be changing also. As more people move out west, if you own a factory on the East Coast, you're going to want to tap the markets in the West. You're going to want to sell your products out there. So how does that happen? How do you get products from the East Coast to the Midwest efficiently so you can make money if you're a factory? Because, that's where people are moving. So you want to be able to tap those markets in the West. Famous quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson that Europe stretches to the Alleghenies, which is right there along the Appalachian Mountains. America lies beyond. So yeah, basically what Ralph Waldo Emerson is saying, if you live on the East Coast, you haven't really experienced America. America lies beyond the Appalachian Mountains, where you got to survive. Where you got to survive. Survival skills are necessary to live, obviously. So frontier people were people who moved out there. They're individualistic, that they relied on themselves. They were restless. They were always on the move. They were energetic because they had to be, and they were ill-informed. When you moved out there in the beginning, getting information was difficult, communication. So, later on, things like the telegraph and trains and canals will change that. The March of Millions. In 1860, there were 33 states in the Union. The U.S. was the fourth most populous nation in the Western world, and there are many big cities. Most of those big cities are on the East Coast. However, because of railroads and because of canals, that's changing. It allows a place like Chicago in the Midwest to become a big city. So things are changing. As cities grew, the biggest problems in these cities were the crowding of people, which is causing sanitation problems. It's causing sewer problems. Health, plagues are an issue. High birth rate accounted for most of the population growth. However, in the 1850s, immigration was at an all-time high, particularly people coming from two European countries, Ireland and Germany. Let's talk about immigration a bit. Here is the history of immigration in the United States from 1820 all the way to 2010, the last census. We have a census going on now in 2020. But so you could see how low the number of immigrants were in 1820s and 30s, but how it grows over time. And you look at the spike there in the 1840s and then in the 1850s, 1850 to 1860, and then you see it go down between 61 and 70 because of the Civil War, and then kind of go up and down, and then shoots up about 1900, and then goes all the way down during the Great Depression in the 1930s, as you could see right here. This is during the Great Depression. No one was coming to the United States here, and there was, at one point, more people left the United States. I think it was 1931. More people left in a year than came into the United States. The only year in history of this country where that happened. And then you see the upswing in immigration in the 2000s, particularly from Latin American countries. Let's talk about the Irish particularly, right, specifically here. In the 1840s, millions of Irish came over because of the potato famine. It was a disease crop in Ireland that destroyed crops for years, the potato. The potato was everything to those people in Ireland. It's what they ate in every meal. It's what they sold. It's their cash crop. It's how they survived. And because of no potatoes, and because of all of a sudden, out of nowhere, people were starving in the streets, many of them came to America in search of a better life. Most of these Irish that came to America, the last thing they wanted to do was to go and farm because of the bad experience they had in Ireland. They were afraid that was going to happen here. So they settled in the cities, and they worked in factories, and they drove down wages, and they became a target for Americans who didn't want them around. Americans were racist against Irish. There were fights. There was animosity directed at them. Definitely, Americans were anti-immigration in the 1840s. They had never really experienced immigration, and here come these Irish coming over, and they're driving down wages, and they're willing to work for half of what Americans were working for. So many Americans were fired, and Irish immigrants were hired, and that caused the resentfulness at the work site, and it just permeated through society. People were decidedly anti-Irish at the time, and they were willing to live in the slums and accept low-paying jobs. Many of these factories would post on their wall NINA, or no Irish need apply, because of what the Irish, even though they could pay them half of what they paid any other workers, but the Irish would bring with them that deep-seated hatred by others who were working at those factories, and it would cause problems, and it would interfere with production. And many of these factories just said, we don't care if we could, hire them for half of what we can hire everybody else. We don't want them around, because of what they brought to the work site. So NINA, no Irish need apply, because of everything directed at them. Because of numbers, they became a powerful political force in places like New York and Boston. So many Irish settled there, and they would all vote, and usually they would vote for the same person. They vote in a block. They tended to vote that way, and whoever they would back would tend to win. So they did become a powerful political force. And if you were running for office, you might want to get the Irish on your side. However, you had to be careful, because if you did too much for the Irish, then the rest of the people would turn against you. So it was politics at its finest, no doubt. And you could see Irish immigration to the United States, the peaks and valleys, but you could see the time period we're talking about now in the 1840s, when the potato famine hit. And that's what happened to the potato crop right there. That's a potato that is infected with the fungus that was in the dirt for a long time, until it finally dissipated after a couple years. But the damage was done. And here's a potato famine memorial in Dublin, Ireland. You can see how poor people that were there, and many of them packed their belongings and came to America. Okay, the next group we're going to talk about that came over in large numbers during this time, about the same time, were the Germans. The Germans came to the United States because of crop failures, because of political unrest, because of wars. There was just a lot of instability within Germany during this time. So many of these Germans decided, well, we'll just come to America. Most of the Germans came over with money, so they weren't discriminated against. They weren't willing to just stay in the cities. They weren't willing to take low-paying jobs. They weren't driving down wages. So there wasn't this hatred directed at them. As a matter of fact, most of the Germans would pack up their things once they got to the east coast of the United States, and they'd move out west. Some of them would move to places like Wisconsin, where they would brew beer. St. Louis, Missouri, where they would brew beer. But they came educated, usually, because German immigration is strong. German education is strong. So people came over with somewhat of a educational background, and some of them rose up in politics, like Carl Schurz. So they had many contributions, like the Conestoga wagon, the Kentucky rifle, the Christmas tree, and kindergarten were all German contributions to American society, what they brought over. So not very much discrimination against them. There's South Dakota, a family in South Dakota. That was another Western state or territory at the time that people would move into. And you could see the numbers, German immigration. Again, it coincides with maybe a little bit later than the Irish immigration. Okay, with all these immigrants coming in, especially the Irish, it led to the rise of a hate party, a party that didn't like immigrants. They were racist. They were known as the American Party, but better known as the Know Nothing Party. Why Know Nothing? Well, whenever anybody would ask them what their party platform was, it was like top secret stuff. They would say their patent phrase was, "I know nothing." So that became the name of their party. everybody knew them as the Know Nothing Party and not the American Party. But whenever you have large numbers of immigrants that are coming in, the reaction by many of the native-born Americans would be to form political parties or hate groups like the KKK later on, white leagues, things like that. And currently you see with those people who are followers of Trump, the Proud Boys, things like that. They are reactions against immigrants coming in to this country. And this was a, dare I say, legit political party because they did get people elected into Congress. Not a president, although they ran people for president, but they never won. Okay, shifting gears to the Industrial Revolution. Not really shifting gears because a lot of the labor that was provided in the industry, in the factories, was provided by immigrants, mostly Irish immigrants at the time, unless NINA was on the wall and they could not go in there. Some factories invited Irish in because they could pay them less, and some didn't allow them because of the animosity that created. So the definition of the Industrial Revolution, something that everybody should know about, and it starts about 1800 in the United States, is the change from handmade to machine-made goods. So instead of sewing their clothes at home, factories were making clothes. So that is what the Industrial Revolution was. And it's not only about clothes, it's about furniture and it's about other things, and later on cars and industry, factories. It came to the United States late. I think I've mentioned it before in this class that the Industrial Revolution hit Europe about 100 years before it came to America. And here are some reasons why. One, land in America was fairly cheap. So why would someone want to go work in a factory when they could go and work a little bit and buy some land cheaply and start growing crops? Unless you're the Irish, who had a bad experience with had a bad experience with farms, and they didn't want to go buy a piece of land. They'd rather work in a factory. Labor was scarce at first. That'll change with immigration. But again, labor is scarce, not necessarily because there's small numbers of people, but because there's small numbers of people who would really want to work in a factory during this time. Like I said, look at the line before. Land was cheap. Why would you want to work in a factory? So labor was scarce. Money for capital investment was not plentiful. When you talk about capital investment, that's, who has enough money to be able to build a factory from the ground up? Not very many people at that time. So they didn't have a lot of money around to build these factories. And they didn't even, a lot of them, they didn't know how, right? That's another one down here, is that nobody knew how to build a factory where you'd have a mill, where you'd have to have running water to turn a water wheel, to work the gears, to make the clothes, to do the sewing, to make the clothes. They didn't know how to construct that. Raw materials weren't yet discovered. They will, like coal later on. There were few consumers, right? If you have factories, you're going to need to sell your products to someone, and there weren't enough consumers. And plus, the factory-made goods that America got was from Britain, and it was at a cheap price. So there wasn't a big push to have factories here. And we were just a land of farmers. Now, what changes that is the Embargo Act of 1807, where Jefferson shut every harbor so that we weren't getting goods in from Great Britain anymore. The British blockade in the War of 1812, and the fact that we're fighting the British during this time, we're not getting factory-made goods. So we were going without factory-made goods. It was back to the olden days where people would just make their clothes by hand. So in order to stop that, to get factory-made goods, we started to think about building our own factories. The number one source of labor in factories was men, but if you had a job that was pretty simple, you can hire women or you could hire kids. Believe it or not, child labor was a big part of a lot of these factories. And here's a general rule of thumb. You paid women half of what they paid men, and they paid kids half of what they paid women. So hiring kids, a lot of places did that. As sad as that sounds, kids 8, 9, 10 years old, like some of these kids that you see right here, doing dangerous work by dangerous machinery, losing arms, legs, toes, fingers, very common. these kids had to grow up really quickly. Now you might ask, what parent would allow their kid to go work in a factory? And I tell you that it would be desperate parents who don't have any money, and they'd send their 8-year-old kid, like these kids, to go work in a factory and bring home a wage. By the time these kids are 25, they're old, and many of them die young. I mean, take a look at this kid right here. Look at his posture. This is what he probably does all day long. Just look at that posture. He's got no shoes on. Look at this kid right here, barefoot, standing up on this, could fall at any time. Arm could get caught in this conveyor belt. It happened all the time. Pretty sad. The guy who brought over the blueprints for the first factory, his name was Samuel Slater, and he was from England. England didn't want their secrets of how to build a factory to get to anywhere, to America, because then that would be someone that they'd have to eventually compete with, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Samuel Slater answered an ad by Moses Brown in an underground newspaper. It said that he would be willing to pay a lot of money to anyone who could come over to America and build a textile mill. A textile mill is a mill where they make clothes. Samuel Slater knew how to do this. He was brilliant. He didn't bring anything on paper because he knew if he got caught, he could be put in jail. And he came over to Rhode Island, and he built this mill right here, Pawtucket, Rhode Island. It's known as Old Slater Mill, and it was the first textile mill in America, and it kicked off the Industrial Revolution, and that's why Samuel Slater is known as the father of the Industrial Revolution. You see, it's right here by a waterfall. The power of falling water was necessary at this time to turn the water wheel, which would turn the gears to make the work possible to sew the clothing, make the clothing in the mill. Now, you might ask, what happens if the river dries up? Then you close down the factory. No water, no factory. So you needed to have running water going through there. They do everything they could to, make sure that water is running. Not that they could make rain or whatnot, but making sure that water didn't get dammed up by beavers or anything like that upriver. So they'd want the water to continue to flow. But sometimes Mother Nature happens and you just can't do anything about it. But the power of falling water provided the energy necessary to run the mill. No electricity. Electricity would be nice, but they don't have it yet. Water was something that was relentless, kept going, doesn't get tired. Like if you had a sewing machine where you would pedal it with your feet, your legs get tired and you can no longer, use that sewing machine. But the power of falling water, it never gets tired. That's why many of these factories are in New England, because you have fast-moving rivers. And New England had poor soil, so they couldn't really grow crops. They did have fast-moving rivers, an abundance of labor up there, and deep harbors like Boston, and you can make goods and send them out. So New England became the center for the first ever factories. To take care of how they paid for them, the Boston Associates was one of the first ever investment capital companies in American history. And it's very similar to the Virginia Company, where they would pool their money together. Everybody pools their money together, and then they build a factory. And the Boston Associates, that's what they did. They pooled money together, they built factories, and that's how things happen. Not very few individuals who had enough money to build a factory. If you didn't, you had created investment capital companies that did it for you. And it provided limited liability, which means if I invest in this Boston Associates and it doesn't work out, I lose my investment, but they can't come after me for anything else. It's like investing in the stock market. If you invest in a company and that company does well, you make a profit off of it. If that company goes under, you lose your investment, but they can't come after you for more. It's limited liability. Okay, so Southerners like to call northern factory workers wage slaves, because Northerners would call them on having slaves and tell them how wrong it was. Well, Southerners would always say, well, you have wage slaves up there. So wage slaves mean they got paid barely anything. They worked to sun up to sundown 6 days a week. and they wore these people out big time. Big time. They would wear them out. Child labor, uh, just bad working conditions, deaths on the job, just not a great situation. There was very little union representation back then because jobs were so menial that if someone just said, I'm going to go on strike, they'd say, good, go. We got other people who could fill in your job. As time went on, jobs became a little bit more difficult, and it was harder to just fire everybody and hire new people, because you fire people with job skills and you lose out on efficiency. But there's a court case called Commonwealth versus Hunt in 1842, in which the Massachusetts Supreme Court provided this important precedent that labor unions are legal and they are not illegal conspiracies. There were attempts made early to create labor unions, and they were always shot down in court as illegal conspiracies, that workers cannot conspire against the owners of factories. They call it conspiracy. Commonwealth versus Hunt opened the door very slightly to unionization in the United States. It's really not going to happen for another 40 years after this, but when it does, you could look back and say Commonwealth versus Hunt in Massachusetts was the one court case that opened the door for to legally join a labor union. And again, some more pictures, child labor pictures. This looks like a similar picture from before, if not the same. This is a kid that works in a mine, probably in somewhere like Pennsylvania. These kids have a very short life. They get that coal in their lungs and it kills them. These kids looks like they're making brooms. These kids right here doing something, can't tell what it is, but it looks like a bitterly cold room, filthy, dark. This guy is watching over him, and if you see what he has in his hand, he has a pipe. Any one of these kids slows down at any time, he's going to whack him in the back with that pipe. Pretty brutal. Women, many factories prefer to hire women because they could pay them less. They could pay, like I said, women half of what they paid men. Most factory jobs, though, were done by men, but some by women and some by kids. A lot of the working women, they were single because they didn't have time to go and meet anybody. Most of the women at this time were enshrined in what's called the cult of domesticity, the glorification of the housewife. It was women at home having kids, taking care of family, taking care of the house. Times were beginning to change in this time in the 1840s and 50s. Arranged marriages were dying down. Marriages because of love made families closer. Families were growing smaller. Women were just not barefoot and pregnant all the time. There was a change, and women were asserting themselves. Again, there were some women working in factories that weren't married, but the majority of women were enshrined in this cult of domesticity in the 1840s, where the family was becoming more important. Those women that were working in factories like this. In Lowell, Massachusetts, a guy by the name of Francis Cabot Lowell, the town is named after him. He came up with this unique idea to build a factory, a state-of-the-art factory for women that was just clean and new, and then have dormitories for them where they were clean dormitories. They were beautiful. Women would love to work there, and they would have such a positive experience later that they would have their own children go to work there. He had this whole idea that women were going to love working at the Lowell factories. And it started out that way, but it quickly turned into the slums. And the women that were working in the Lowell factories would never get married because they wouldn't be out there and meeting men or anything like that. And they'd stay there and they'd become old maids, and they would never marry. So his utopian society of his factory and the living environment never really materialized. And you have these women don't look very happy, but these are Lowell factory women right here.